Several maids arrived, delivering trays containing the last of the pre-prepared meals from the city. The chef and their entourage would reuse the magical items that stored them to prepare new courses for the next few days of their stay with supplies purchased from Croston. The food situation in Facetown was so aggravated that prices had inflated to several times the market value of the next town along the highway. As it was due to supplies being purposely withheld by those in power rather than any true shortage, merchants were either intercepted and bought out by agents of each faction or turned away outright. After the maids arranged their meal and left to attend to other duties, Clara picked up their discussion. "I'm not hopeful that there's any chance for House Facet and most of their collaborators," she said. "What I'm worried about now is where we draw the line between someone who skirts the law to survive and one that actively undermines order for purely selfish reasons." "Is there a difference?" Leanne said. "Everyone that participates undermines order, and survival is an inherently selfish reason. Even the farmers and woodsmen far out on the edges of the developed lands dirty their hands here, becoming thugs, selling out their own and bringing harm to their fellows. They may claim that they do it to survive, but in doing so they deny the same to others. That is the way things are here, as far as I can see. There is none of the surplus and growth that you see from properly managed fiefs, only the ever-diminishing scraps that the people fight over as the Facets and their goons bleed out their domain to no good end." "Even these children that we've picked up?" Florine asked. "They're the same, just lucky enough to be picked up by us to assist in our investigation here. It's rather unfair." The head of House Gonnier cut herself off and scowled at the ground. "Unfair?" Though the word was cut off, it still echoed in their minds. No one present believed that life was absolutely fair. It would be shamelessly hypocritical for a scion of a noble house to even suggest such a thing. They were born to authority, wealth and countless other advantages garnered through generations of planning and effort by others. In the end, all that they could hope for was that everything that went into their rule would lead to success, and that this success would benefit their subjects in some meaningful way. As much as one might have wanted to create some perfectly fair world, it was unrealistic at best and destructive at worst. "These children, as you say," Leanne answered, "are lucky. Unless they're caught doing something that they shouldn't be, they'll reap the benefits of that luck. Fortune can be fickle, and disaster may strike even the most fastidious and righteous of people. Perhaps something can be done over much longer spans of time with the population at large, but Facet County has no such luxury now." "I considered redistributing the population," Clara said, "but it's both something we cannot immediately afford and we could end up poisoning every other fief with this behavior instead of rehabilitating the people as we had intended. Leanne is correct that we currently do not have the luxury to attempt this, and she is also correct that it is something that can be done with time on a broader level. Last week I spoke with Miss Yuri Alpha, and it seems she is doing just that by starting with a major orphanage in the city. It is beyond just a shelter for children. I would personally like to see branches of this institution spread over my entire domain. She has a shared interest in doing so, and is willing to cooperate with me to establish another facility in the new harbor town. So it's not simply a place for orphans." Florine's interest was piqued. "What is it exactly?" "My interpretation of the concept may be flawed," Clara replied, "but on a very general level it is the groundwork for a new system of social welfare and education. Beyond the orphanage it's stated to be, it's also a type of school, which is not limited to the orphans. Through this institution, children are provided a standard basic education, and those that show promise in various areas are encouraged to contribute to the Sorceress Kingdom through their talents as working adults. The intent is not simply benevolent, it is also progressively beneficial for the long term as more and more of the population is educated and trained." "That sounds wonderful," Florian said. "Should we all be opening our own orphanages as well?" "For the time being, only the orphanage in the city is being subsidized by the Sorceress Kingdom," Clara answered. "The one being built in the harbor is through my own funds, and it's more of a school with accommodations for the students rather than an orphanage. The hope is that once the institution starts turning out promising results, Miss Alpha can make a case for its expansion as a nationwide system. I have no expectation of masses of orphans being a common thing in the future, so the orphanage in the city is sufficient. Schools, on the other hand, will perhaps be appearing across the nation within our generation." Ludmilla had spoken of knowledge, understanding and how it would change their lives earlier that day, But it seemed that the Sorceress Kingdom was already far ahead of her thoughts and well underway in establishing both a means to distribute and regulate it for the benefit of the nation. Once again, the excellence of the upper echelon of the administration had definitively proven itself far beyond her meager grasp of things. After they had settled their meals, the four noble women returned to the task at hand. The magical light continued to burn as brightly as it had throughout the day. The surface of the table had been cleaned up while they were having dinner and fresh glasses of cuts had been placed on their coasters. Ludmilla reached out and pulled a new set of documents to herself. Liane pointed at the surface of the table near Ludmilla. "Could you push that thingy back over to the middle?" Ludmilla's gaze traced a line to where she was pointing. There was a polished crystal disc framed in bronze that had been dragged along with the file she had pulled away. She lifted it up and placed it back in the center of the table. "What is it?" Ludmilla asked. "It's a magic item that repels vermin," Liane replied. "When activated, it creates a field slightly larger than this pavilion, so we want it right in the middle or things come crawling in and get stuck." "I see." Ludmilla had assumed that it was a paperweight, seeing it on the corner of the file. She now understood why wasps and flies weren't being drawn to the cut's juice, insects weren't swarming the magical light, and nothing had crawled up her skirts for the entire day in the pavilion. "House Wagner employs quite a lot of magical items," she remarked. "One of the advantages to having so many merchant companies," Liane grinned. "We get to see what is being sold in the wide world. Riestais is a backwater of a backwater when it comes to magical items for daily life. Even the Empire handily outstrips us in this regard, and they used to be a part of Riestais. I'm fairly certain a third of the various magical utility items in Riestais were introduced by House Wagner and our affiliates deeper within the kingdom." "Aren't magic items expensive?" Ludmilla asked. I suppose your basis of reference might be the equipment used by adventurers," Liane replied. "That sort of equipment is quite expensive, but much of the reason is due to adventurers themselves creating demand for very specific items, on top of being terrible merchants with no connections. While I wouldn't exactly say that they are mass-produced, the common items that you see for everyday use are created in sufficient quantities to be competitively priced and generally affordable. If anything, they are often cheaper in the long run than their conventional counterparts." Liane pointed to the magical light above them. "This item is enchanted with a continual light spell, and will last forever unless broken. As a source of illumination, it's better than any torch, lamp or candle. It's far brighter, has no odor or smoke, and won't spark accidental fires. Imagine the cost of providing fuel for a similar quality of illumination, and how long it would take until it surpasses the cost of a magical light. It's easy to see that, after a relatively short span of time, the magic item is cheaper, though I suppose I don't know the conditions of your barony, or if this item would survive conditions on the border. I should really pay you a visit one of these days." Ludmilla thought that she would curl up and die of embarrassment in some lonely corner if Liane saw the markedly backward state of her domain. At this point, she would have believed it if someone told her that Baroness Wagner traveled around the world on luxurious flying coaches, while Baroness Zaradnik mucked through the savage wilderness in the darkness with muddy boots and biting insects all around. "The entire place is being turned upside down, so perhaps when things are not so hectic," Ludmilla said. "That is, if we all survive House Facet's folly. Which still seems to depend on how we can pressure them into relenting." Clara's expression was flat as she flipped through the pages of the file. "This last report does not make things look any better." Ludmilla looked down in front of her. Clara had taken the documents while she had been discussing magical items with Liane. Chagrined, she pushed thoughts of her own domain out of her mind. "How could we ever get them to agree?" Florine asked. "With just what we've collected, House Facet is done for. For that matter, this is so severe that it will almost certainly cast doubt on the rest of us." "I believe it will have to come down to what Ludmilla already prescribed," Clara answered. "We no longer care for what they are willing to agree to, we must force them to come to terms. Just how we will accomplish this is the question now, and what this will gain in our efforts to avert the looming disaster with the royal court." Clara, Liane and Florine looked to Ludmilla. "My thoughts are still roughly the same," Ludmilla said, looking around the table. "We need to undermine their confidence by removing what they believe is supporting them. House Facet is not of a militant lineage, they rely entirely on their retainers and hirelings as a way to back up their words with the threat of force. Now that we have information on the relative disposition of their strength, we can figure out just how we can hurt them the most. So, say we accomplish this, Leanne said. We deal with the various ringleaders working under the Facets and, if they're still not convinced, we take Jacqueline and Campbell into our custody. What then? How will this solve the greater problem? With the leadership gone, Clara said, we should be able to employ Count Vulkenheim's proposal to establish a new foundation for the industries of this territory. The land is underutilized and we may even be able to alleviate some of the labor imbalances in the other territories by encouraging migration here. I'm uncertain what sort of oversight the Royal Court will prescribe to Facet County, but, with everything in place, we'll be able to begin the long process of returning this land to normal. Ludmilla's thoughts on this part had not changed either. It seemed the most productive course, as things could only get better in the county. She hesitated for a moment, as the answer to the outcome in relation to the House of Lords was nebulous at best. With the time that we have left, Ludmilla told them, displacing the leadership and creating a comprehensive report with our recommendations is the most we can do here. Following this, we must make our case to the Royal Court. They will learn the true scope of all of this sooner or later, and it is better for us to come to them than it is for them to come to their own conclusions. What matters when we do is whether we can impress upon His Majesty's Cabinet that what we have done reflects our conviction in upholding His Majesty's will, that the wholesale restructuring of the law is unnecessary, and the nobility can still be trusted to carry out their duties. As expected, it was not a wholly welcome answer. Leanne drained her glass and let out a loud sigh, while Clara and Florian had worried looks on their faces. Ludmilla knew that Clara understood, and hoped Florian and Leanne did as well. Gone were the days when they watched their parents make critical decisions, and the only thing they needed to worry about was developing proper etiquette and reciting lists of facts and figures. Now leading their own houses, there was no guaranteed solution, no one to tell them if their path would lead them to success. There was only what they understood and how they would act with what was available for them to use, and the results of their actions would come at a point well past any opportunity to change what they had done. Leather straps creaked as Ludmilla tightened a steel bracer snugly over her wrist. She checked over her equipment one last time. The set consisting of the gambesine, she was still paranoid that carried the scent of smashed cockroaches, and the various steel pieces that she had purchased from Mesmet's forge were still not quite broken in, but it was functional where it counted. There were 2 quivers of arrows fastened to her belt in addition to the dagger and axe she had purchased the same day. Reaching out to pick up her sallet, she placed it over the layer of cloth covering her hair and fastened the chin strap. She lowered her visor, and the helmet closed neatly over her before and gorged it. Clara, Leanne and Florian stood around her. Several others around the camp kept glancing in their direction as well. Ludmilla focused on her equipment as she donned it, but she couldn't help but feel that she was being watched like some rare animal. Well, she lifted her visor again to pull on her gauntlets. How do I look? Clara gave her a once-over, her gaze settling over Ludmilla's torso. Like an adventurer? Ludmilla's hand came up to feel the metal tag fastened below her collar. It was her first time wearing it since returning from the strange adventurer exam just over 3 days ago. Little did she know that its first use would be as part of a disguise. That's what I was trying for, she said. I'll be going on ahead. I've assigned one of the shadow demons to guard you just in case something goes wrong on your end. Clara peered down at her shadow. At what point will it act? She asked, continuing to examine the darkness for the demon within. It will defend you if it recognizes that you are being attacked, and try to eliminate any assailants if doing so doesn't put you and the others at risk, Ludmilla said. You can also order it to attack if you feel that conflict is inevitable and want to strike preemptively. Just make sure you get to safety as quickly as possible if fighting breaks out. The shadow demon can easily overpower anyone Jacqueline has working for her, but it cannot defend you at all times from all directions. The less it has to focus on keeping you safe, the faster it will remove any threats. Her friend nodded in understanding, but her worried expression did not fade. Are you going to be okay going into the town on your own? Clara asked. Common thugs aren't likely to pick a fight with an equipped adventurer, Ludmilla answered. Besides, I'm not going on my own, I have the two other shadow demons with me to check around the town to measure the reaction to your audience with Jacqueline Facet. The first move they had decided on was to inform Jacqueline Facet through the course of their audience that an inspector from the royal court was due to arrive within the day to perform a thorough audit of the town. By doing so, they hoped that she would make some sort of effort to move her forces out of sight. If it succeeded, they would employ the same ruse against Campbell the next morning, then clean up the separated groups. Hopefully it would give the siblings a push in the right direction once they realized they had been rendered impotent, if it even worked at all. If not, well, Ludmilla supposed it hardly mattered at that point and she would have to drag them out of their manners by force. Doing things as neatly as possible was the goal now, with what time that they had. There were still the days of cleaning up that needed to be done after paralyzing both factions. The plan amounted to removing the leadership and their major supporters, tying up what loose ends they could, and praying that their work was enough to appease the royal court. It was not the best plan by any stretch of the imagination, but it was far better than what could be achieved with the woefully insufficient means that the House of Lords had dispatched them with on the outset of their task. Ludmilla slung her shield over one shoulder and a half-empty satchel over the other. She retrieved her longbow and spear from where they leaned against the carriage, setting out from the encampment towards the town as the other noble women prepared to leave in their carriage. After a light jog, she approached the gate of the town 10 minutes later. The militia sentries only took notice of her when she entered the circle of torchlight that extended about 30 meters from the sturdy wooden gatehouse. Well, one of them did, at least. He loudly called the others' attention towards her, and the two standing in the wooden towers above readied their bows. The second man on the ground nearly tripped over himself after being startled from his nap. The first sentry gave her a once-over as she approached, while his partner bent forward to recover the spear he had dropped on the ground. "That's far enough," he called out to her. "What are you doing here, adventurer?" Ludmilla came to a stop on the highway 20 meters from the gate. Despite the poor lighting, he had spotted the small iron plate from beyond that distance. However inept the other sentries were, the first man was neatly making up for their shortfalls. She was an easy target if the two on the wall were practiced archers, and there was more than enough time for the two men on the ground to react if she charged the gate. The manner by which he handled himself and managed risks spoke of his experience as a veteran of the town militia. "I came from out east," Ludmilla answered. "From Croston?" He raised his eyebrows. "That's quite a trip for a day in that kit, even for an adventurer." "I thought I'd be able to stop in the village south of here," she explained, "but there's some sort of commotion going on there." "What kind of commotion?" The sentry frowned. The distant sound of hooves turned her attention away from his question. From the south, the lights of twin carriage lamps approached. Ludmilla stepped over to the side of the road as it came up to the gate. "You're back," he spoke up to the driver. "What now?" "Countess Corlin and her entourage, to visit Jacqueline Facet," the driver declared their purpose in a somewhat flat voice, pointedly ignoring her presence. The sentry seemed like he wanted to say something, but thought better of it and waved them through. The carriage disappeared around a bend in the road and the man cleared his throat to spit on the ground. "That driver didn't even look at me," Ludmilla frowned. "Think he'd have just run me over if I stood there?" "Probably," the man grunted. "Some haughty nobles from out east. The Countess probably brought 'em in to get them to help with this whole mess. They aren't staying at the manor, not the town either. They set up some sort of camp up on the hill back there. You probably saw it coming in. Up to no good, if you ask me." "If not the manor, why not the town?" she asked. "Camping outside doesn't seem like something nobles would do." "Hell if I know," he shrugged. "Maybe they saw the prices in town." "Well, probably not. Nobles from around the city are filthy rich. Now, you were saying there was some sort of commotion in the big village down south." Yeah," Ludmilla cleared her throat. "There were some coaches with the new kingdom's flags. Men in uniforms. Undead soldiers too." The men in Facet colors around the square looked worried. "You hear anything about who came?" "Just some sort of official," Ludmilla replied. "I didn't care to find out with all those undead hanging around. They've taken all the work, can't make a living here anymore. Staying in town, I guess? Roads aren't safe at night past the border. Can an adventurer even afford to stay here now? You said something about the prices." "Iron could, maybe," the sentry scratched his jaw. I wouldn't hope for more than the common room though. Food'll probably double the price for the night. Despite already knowing about it, Ludmilla could not help but grimace. In Facet County, one could engage in slavery and trafficking of contraband with little but a slap on the wrist upon being caught. Those that went out to hunt and forage to feed their starving families were charged as poachers and thieves, turned into slaves themselves, or simply added to the bodies hanging from the gibbet in the town center. She stepped forward to pass through the gate, and felt the gaze of the sentries pass over her figure once again. Countess is looking for strong fighters to help keep things tight down here, the first sentry spoke again. Pays better than what an iron makes, more reliable too, and you won't be out risking yourself fighting demis and monsters. Her brow furrowed at his proposition. Adventurers don't interfere. Right, I heard it, he waved her through with a lazy smirk to his fellows. Ludmilla's initial estimation of the man had been fairly high, due to how he performed as a sentry. By the time she walked through the gate, however, it had sunk to somewhere just below the muck one would scrape off their boots after a long patrol. Rather than a capable official that promoted order, he was a capable official that facilitated crime and corruption. It would have been much better if he had been as incompetent as the others on his watch. The view of the town streets differed little from what she had seen from the windows of the carriage the previous day. The wide, paved route of the highway curved through the town, lined with merchant inns and the storefronts of businesses that catered to both travelers and county citizenry alike. Beneath the thin veneer of the swept highway and its festive decorations, signs of the town's true nature peeked out from every narrow street and alley. The scarce few who dared brave the streets at night were no less than what one might have expected out of a scene painted by a tavern bard, men and women that kept to themselves in the shadows, with hands that constantly drifted over their sidearms. She stopped to look up at the bodies hanging over the central square, which swung gently in the wind amidst fluttering flags of every color. The gaze of the militia sentries followed her slow walk along the road. It was not just them, every thug, orphan waif and beggar seemed to pause what they were doing to watch her as she passed. Though it was meant to be a disguise, the shining steel and clean linens of her carefully maintained equipment in these surroundings was about as conspicuous as a pair of death knights stomping through the street. Continuing up the road under this scrutiny, she felt a tug at her arm. She turned to see a woman who stood at roughly the height of her shoulder, sporting a head of dark red hair braided into a long tail behind her. Looking for a place to stay the night? She smiled playfully. I'll take real good care of you. A hand with thin fingers and dull, dry nails reached out to lightly trace a line over Ludmilla's polished gorget as the woman closed to press against her. Wait, what? Two armed ruffians across the road exploded into laughter at her reaction. Ludmilla felt her face heating up as she pulled away from the woman and quickly walked away with the sound nipping at her heels. The prostitute clicked her tongue, and Ludmilla didn't slow her pace again until she was nearly to the other end of the town. A small part of her had wanted to wander around and personally observe the streets, hoping that the conclusions that they had made with their reconnaissance efforts missed some small bright side to its people. Having covered most of its length along the highway, however, she couldn't say that she had seen anything that suggested there was any case of this being true. The people had their own lives, families and circumstances, to be certain, but there was nothing that spoke of defiance or resistance to the common practices of the townsfolk. After a time, however, she came to realize that any such beliefs would surely be held close to survive, and not something she could discover so casually. Rather than agonize over whether such people may or may not exist, she headed straight to a point on the map of the town she had memorized. There were two gates leading out of Facetown. The first was the south gate, which she had entered from. The second was the northwest gate, where the pavement of the highway stretched out for another 10 or 15 kilometers before reaching the border between the Sorceress Kingdom and Riesties. Finding a corner draped heavily in shadows, brushed off an old crate before seating herself upon it. They should have just arrived at the manor, she told one of the shadow demons, so start keeping track of what's going on around the city. Check the south gate once in a while though, if it looks like the camp is going to be in trouble, assist in its defense. It nodded in affirmation before flickering away to carry out its orders. The second shadow demon looked up at her with its yellow eyes. I guess it's just you and me now, she said to her translucent escort. Settling herself in the darkness, Ludmilla did her best to conceal her presence, assuming her quiet vigil. Jacqueline Facet's reaction to Clara's information was markedly pronounced. In the shadows of the night, at roughly the same time that Clara's escorting shadow demon returned to Ludmilla to receive new orders, the windows of darkened buildings glowed with dim light and sounds of activity began to spill out from the streets and alleys, filling the air over the town with the quiet din of horses and people preparing in large numbers. With the idea that something would happen to the various shady elements identified around the town, House Facet's tangle of connections were made plain before her eyes as they reorganized themselves to avoid potential trouble. Though she could not hear what was being said from street to street, their actions were clear enough as whole blocks came to life, full of rough men and women unified with this single purpose in mind. Clara had wanted to make one last effort to sway the stubborn daughter of House Facet, only leaving behind the information that would set off their ploy in the event of her failure to do so. The reaction to this news came in visible waves of activity that rippled out from the Facet manor. Ludmilla knew what to roughly expect as the reaction had been projected in advance of their meeting, yet, while she was looking down at the web of associations identified on the map in the pavilion, there was still a small corner of her mind that refused to believe things were entirely as they appeared. This feeling of doubt sloughed off of her with every warehouse, tavern and common house emptied. Jacqueline Facet had clearly panicked at the news, and now it seemed she was trying to remove every shred of evidence of her activities that she could. Wagons were loaded with men and cargo, though the shadow demons dispatched to track them reported that everything was simply being shifted out of the way to nearby hamlets. Disbelief was replaced by a simmering mood as more and more of the shadow demons' reports coalesced to paint the picture of men and materials streaming away from the town. At this point it seemed that over half of the population and most of the materials being stored had been deemed too risky to expose to the supposed audit. Ludmilla no longer made any attempts to justify the movements with other, innocuous reasons. Each report simply became a point to revisit in detail once the commotion died down. "I've heard enough," she finally said to the shadow demons reporting to her. "Take your information to the camp and keep working with them to keep track of where everything is being directed." Tamping down on the dull sense of irritation that had built up with every report, she remained at her concealed position near the western gate, watching carts and wagons trickle away into the night. An hour later, just as she thought the flow of goods and people had ended, the hollow rattle of an empty wagon drew her attention to a nearby street. Two mottled draft horses appeared, drawing an uncovered wagon with a single driver. As it trundled by, Ludmilla saw that the bed of the vehicle was entirely bare. While she pondered the way it stood distinct from the other, laden wagons, it stopped just outside of the open gate. She strained her ears as the driver leaned over to speak to one of the sentries in low tones, but could only hear low murmuring between them. After a short conversation, the driver straightened in his seat and the sentry hopped on beside him. One of the men above on the gatehouse dropped down from a ladder and jogged up to pull himself into the back of the wagon. They started rolling forward again. "Hey, wait up!" a voice called out after them. The two remaining sentries manning the gate scrambled to climb on board. The wagon slowed for them just long enough to do so before continuing on its way. "Did they just abandon their post?" she muttered, aghast. Despite everything she had seen, Ludmilla was still dismayed at their act. At her feet, the shadow demon's eyes gleamed. Unforgivable, its voice drifted up at her. "Shall I slay them?" She agreed with the demon's sentiment, but something was still off. "Let's see what they're up to for now," she replied. "If they planned on running away, they should have left with what goods they could find from the town, but there was nothing loaded in the wagon that I could see. There must be something more valuable that they're reserving space for." Ludmilla was unable to read its reaction to her reply through its inhuman expression. At the least, it did not appear to oppose her line of thought entirely. "Follow them and see where they end up," she ordered. The demon remained near her feet, shaking its head. "This one cannot comply," it said. "Lady Shiltier has prioritized your safety. The risk is too great in this location for you to remain without escort." "Even the ones that managed to spot me don't dare approach," Ludmilla said. "I don't think there's that much of a risk." The shadow demon shrugged, unconvinced by her argument. While suspicious figures did occasionally show up to look at her from other dark vantages throughout the evening, all it really took was her staring pointedly back at them for a moment to have them turn away. oblivious to her talent. All they understood was that the capability to detect concealed individuals of their caliber was a sign of a strong individual with scouting abilities. Her iron tag aside, someone that could instantly notice these hidden observers in the darkness should be around the strength of a mithril-rank adventurer. They would not dare to try their luck with such a person who was already armed and alert to their presence. This reasoning did not seem to matter to her shadowy escort, however. The servants of the Sorcerer King and those of his vassals only appeared to consider differences in direct strength, and make their judgments based on that sort of correlation. She had tried to send her escort out to investigate several times when the others were already set to their own tasks, but it doggedly refused to leave her unprotected. Ludmilla appreciated the knowledge that her liege was looking out for her, but she had long grown accustomed to ordering humans, undead and demons around, so it was quite jarring the first time she was refused that night. "Then we'll go take a look together, I guess." Lifting the longbow from her lap and grabbing her spear from where it rested against the box, she hopped off of her seat in pursuit of the strangely empty wagon. Stopping just past the threshold of the gate, she spotted the vehicle slowly making its way through the darkness along the continued curve of the highway. After confirming her quarry, she turned around to look at the unmanned gatehouse. "I still can't believe they just left the gate undefended like that," she grumbled. "Help me close this thing." It only took a couple of minutes to close the gate. She heard the bar fall on the other side, and the shadow demon floated through the door. Turning back to the road, she saw the wagon still rolling along in the distance at its cautious pace. Rather than follow the pavement, Ludmilla cut through the forests alongside it to close the gap between them. In the weeks following the new development in her domain, her skills as a ranger had significantly improved as she patrolled the forested slopes of Warden's Vale to keep the work of her new tenants and laborers unimpeded by wilderness hazards. Now, she could make her way through the thick undergrowth as quickly as a regular person could travel over a grassy plain. The wagon's passengers idly scanned their surroundings as she trailed them through the nearby trees. With only a bare sliver of the moon and the dim lantern hanging from the wagon providing illumination, their gazes passed over her regularly, completely unaware of her presence. They continued for several kilometers before the wagon pulled over on the roadside. The men in the back hopped off to load several dozen sacks that had been left covered on the other side of the ditch that ran alongside the highway. The wagon bed was nearly filled before it lurched back onto the road to continue on its way. Following them a short distance to the west, the cobblestones turned to clay and Ludmilla stopped to watch the men shrink into the distance. Rather than escape to the nearby hamlets of Facet County, this group had fled the Sorcerer's Kingdom entirely, disappearing into the neighboring kingdom of Riastais. The shadow demon rose to its full height beside her. "Kill?" Its voice was tinged with anticipation. Beyond lies Riastais, Ludmilla let out a sigh. "This is as far as we can go." In hindsight, she should have realized where the wagon was inevitably heading and cut their journey short before they crossed the border. It would have been a simple matter to kill or cripple all of the men. Between her talent and her longbow, it was an entirely one-sided ambush in the darkness. The shadow demon did not even need to get involved. "Camilla?" The shadow demon's voice drifted over her. Her cheek twitched at the mention of the name bestowed upon her by Lady Shortier, and its weight bore down on her. Did she really make the right decision? What did it mean to be an extension of Lady Shortier's will, to be her liege's disciple and assist in carrying out her duties? A defender of His Majesty's realm, the first lance to be directed against those who would oppose his will, both within and without. Those that would dare to bring harm to what is his shall be granted no quarter. "Kill them," Ludmilla commanded. "His Majesty's will is not to be denied." The shadow demon flickered away. Ludmilla closed her eyes and let out a breath into the cool night air. Backtracking to the roadside where the men had paused to load their cargo, she looked around to see if she could find any evidence of what the wagon had hauled away. There was nothing left in the depression of grass, but there was a trail which extended into the forest. This far from the town, she could hear the wildlife in the night all around her, a comforting blanket of noise that brought with it familiar sensations that reminded her of her own fief. The shadow demon appeared before her again. "It is done," it said. "Good work," Ludmilla nodded. "What of the bodies?" The shadow demon frowned at her words, tilting its head curiously. "Those men were subjects of the Sorceress Kingdom," she told the shadow demon. "Their corpses belong to His Majesty. Pile them in the wagon and roll it back across the border. I wanted to see what they were hauling anyway. I'll be checking on something in the meanwhile." The shadow demon flickered away again, and Ludmilla turned her attention back to the path leading into the woods, musing over her last set of instructions. One of the very first of the new laws, unassociated with those of Reastais, drafted by the royal court, was the legislation that claimed all of its subjects' corpses as the property of the sorceress kingdom. In return, the administration offered to pay what was normally associated with burial expenses and funerary rites to the next of kin. Ludmilla recalled Bishop Osteen's chuckle when she had gone to ask for his thoughts on it. Apparently the Temple of the Four could do nothing but fume silently, and many of their worshippers took the money anyways. As for the Temple of the Six, they didn't care. Unless resurrection services were in order, a corpse was just a corpse. The souls of humanity were in Sursana's keeping once they passed beyond life. As far as the bishop was concerned, this new measure was yet another blessing for the faith of the Six. Her steps followed the path deep into the woods, until she suddenly came upon a solid line between the forest and a field of waist-high plants waving in the wind all the way to the horizon. With the division between nations marked by the highway before, Ludmilla assumed that this, too, was the border between the Sorceress Kingdom and Reastais. The field should have been some sort of crop cultivated by the tenants of the Baron on the other side of the border, but there were several oddities that were immediately apparent. Unsurprisingly, there was no one to be seen in the huge field in the middle of the night. All there was the lamp of the returning wagon further along the highway, which ran along the length of the field. In the distance, she could see the first village of the neighboring barony and Reastais sitting on a ridge along the highway. This was decidedly strange, as farming hamlets were generally spaced well within viewing distance of the fields that they cultivated, much closer than the distant village that she spotted. The way the paths ran through the field nearby and the way the crop had been collected suggested that it was actually being harvested and brought into Facet County, through the point where she currently stood. The people from Facet County were growing crops using the land of the neighboring baron, either that or they were stealing it, and whether they had the lord's permission or some sort of lease to use the land was not apparent. It was also possible that the nobles administering the land across the border were entirely oblivious to what was going on at the edge of their territory. Leaning down, she picked several bundles of the unfamiliar plants that had grown like weeds into the tree line, placing them into a pouch attached to her belt before returning to the highway. The rumble of the wagon greeted her as she left the trees and entered the roadside ditch. She waited for the vehicle to come to a stop before her before climbing onto the back. The 4 dead men were laid out on the wagon bed, so she had to step over them to reach their cargo. Checking through several of the large bags, she found the same plants as she had on the field. Collecting a few samples regardless, she hopped off the wagon again. "I'll have to arrange some way to get these dead men to wherever they need to go," Ludmilla told the shadow demon. "Let's get back to camp for now." No new vehicles came from the town, and the gate remained undisturbed from when she had closed it. Skirting around the walls, the sounds of activity from before had ceased, and Facetown once again appeared to be asleep. She made a point of staying clear of the south gate with its single watchful sentry. Looking up the way to the distant encampment, she breathed a sigh of relief when nothing appeared to be amiss. It was time to find out how well their ploy had worked.